be quiet, be quiet. Hello, everyone. Thank you to all of our community members for joining us here in our staff open office hours on phase 2 of our elementary school planning data review. Our 1-hour session is scheduled from 1 to 2 p.m. and we really appreciate your time in engaging on this important process with us. We will honor everyone's time by starting and ending on time. Just some items to go through real quick. A link of this live session will be posted online once it's available. All attendees by default are on mute. Attendees may type questions throughout this 1-hour session in the live Q&A box. Got a little icon with a question mark on it. And we do have staff monitoring that Q&A box. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, and some questions may need more time for exploration and will be a part of the Q&A. You will hear from our planning and evaluation team members during this presentation who will address the questions that are received. They're here with us, Lisa Stengel, Executive Director, and Robert Reese, Principal Planner. You will hear individually from them as they address your questions. Of course, our entire team works on this effort in collaboration with School and Community Relations, IS, and Facilities, and of course, other departments. I am going to the next slide. 1 second. During this 1-hour session, we are going to share the overall timeline for the elementary school planning, which are 4 phases in time for 2021, the school year 2021. We're going to share where to access this information on phase 2 data review for the fall boundary process. We're going to share information where you can find information on phase 2, which will be used for the fall boundary process. We're going to answer your questions that we have received thus far through engage@apsva.us, the questionnaire, where we have received over 500 responses, and of course from you during this hour. We're going to address the questions received during this online session about the information being accessible on phase 2 that are related to the data to be used for the boundary process. We know that there's a lot of interest in beginning to talk about boundaries and boundary scenarios. That will happen after this phase. Phase 2 is to set up the data that is going to be used for the boundary adjustment process, and our focus is on the data review for right now. Now I'm actually going to ask Lisa to go over this slide.
So thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you Gladys. So this spring what we're doing is the data review to prepare for the boundary process this fall. This is typically our getting started phase that we've done in previous boundary processes. Part of pulling this out and doing it early allows us to get some more feedback on our information now so that our scenarios that we propose in the fall are better formed and don't have adjustments needed to the baseline data underneath that informs our work. This will be shaped by a cross-departmental team. We'll begin to use this information as we prepare over the summer. And at the same time, we've also got a cross-departmental team beginning to plan for the school moves. As you recall, in the fall and on February 6th, the school board adopted a number of school moves to prepare for 2021-22, when the boundaries and the moves will happen concurrently. This summer, we'll be shaping boundary scenarios, initially within our department and then collaboratively with the people who run elementary schools, including school administrators and central office staff who are experts in that area. Part of the demographics that are included in here will inform that work. We want to make sure that when the schools are formed with these adjusted boundaries, our schools are prepared to serve them and we aren't sort of changing them. in a way that they aren't prepared or they don't have the right staff. In September, we will begin sharing the information on the boundary process and publishing the timeline for the boundary process. And the school board will adopt new boundaries by the first meeting, the school board meeting in December. That information will be used next January for kindergarten information night. And after that, there will be communication that we share with families to get back out to them so they know all of the pieces. They know if their planning unit has moved for some of those families who may not have paid attention. We also have a CIP process going on right now, and there are facility refreshes related to the school moves that are in that CIP process, and those are slated to happen in the summer of 2021. And then fall of 21, in the 21-22 school year, all the moves and boundary changes will take effect concurrently. Next slide, please. So I want to share the objectives for this process. So really, as I mentioned before, this was part of getting started. And we found that in a couple situations that if we don't always know the data as well as you do. We have a lot of information that we get from the county about future housing, new housing, and sometimes there are changes that the community has noted. And so we wanted to put this out early enough that we have time for our staff to go back and make those adjustments. And if it means more students in the projections, we get that reflected now versus waiting and doing it while we're also getting feedback on boundary proposals. So we're being transparent now by putting out the data we'll use by planning unit and hoping that you help us identify anything that needs to be changed. We want you to tell us where something needs to adjust. We will publish this information in August, and it will be the foundation of our work over the summer with the elementary group to make sure that what we have works. I just want to mention, I'll give you an example of something that we've seen that has been really helpful. In the last elementary boundary process, there was a building that was being built, a high-rise that it wouldn't have generated a lot of students, but it wasn't in the data from the county. It was missed, so we were able to go back and add it in. There was also a geocoding issue with a building, a new apartment complex that was on the wrong side of the golf course, so it meant two different boundaries. Having your knowledge of your neighborhood is really helpful. And we've also put out some methodology that was a part of the discussion last year, and we want to make sure that we're getting input from those who are interested in that work. Gladys, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you. Well, like Lisa shared, we really do want to hear from you, and we are appreciative of your input. What we are asking our community members to do is that based on your knowledge of your neighborhoods, review these 3 documents and provide us input by planning unit. We have the APS planning unit data table, and I'll go over that information in a bit on the next slide. We also have the Arlington County table 2 and 3, the unit forecast and housing site plan approvals respectively. And we also provide an APS map with planning units and street names to help in identifying your planning unit on this map. And of course, we have our online questionnaire that is open through June 5th, and that is where you may provide input based on the review of these documents. These are some of the data fields that you will review in the planning unit table. These are the data points that are used to inform decisions when we are in a boundary process. What neighborhood school zone was that planning unit in the current year and in the previous years in all of the 3 levels? And that helps us and makes everyone aware if a particular planning unit was involved in previous boundary processes. Actually, that is a very specific data field that we have. We also have the number of students, K through 5, who live in a planning unit currently. We have those students who attended their neighborhood school, if a particular planning unit is in a WOG zone. We also provide student demographics, and it is going to also be used and reviewed as we work with our instructional leaders to be able to have the data to review, to examine how a boundary adjustment affects the school population, using that instructional lens with our instructional leaders. In the previous elementary boundary process, we had preliminary scenarios that would have greatly affected the instructional model at Barcroft, for example, and working with our instructional leaders and a cross-departmental team and having access to all of this data really provides that crucial lens. So we use the data to inform decisions that we are making. And of course, we have so many other things. If you haven't already, please visit that, look through it, and you will find that you will have questions, you will have comments as it relates to your planning unit once you spend some time reviewing it. We definitely are looking forward to the input, and all of the input is being reviewed. We're also asking the community to review 2 alternative approaches to the planning unit projections methodology. During our last boundary process, there were many questions generated by the community and during discussions during school board work sessions on the methodology approach that we were using. So we're asking community members to review the methodology document and the planning unit data, which provides projections using both approaches. So you can really see, using both approaches, what are the differences by planning unit on either approach. And we want to hear from you. Provide us your input on which methodology approach you prefer, and please tell us why. We do have, like with all of our major initiatives, we have a dedicated webpage for the data review process by visiting apsva.us/engage. And this is, that particular website is the hub for the major priorities in APS. And once you land on that webpage, it will be the first thing that you see on there. Data review for fall 2012 elementary school boundary process. And once you're in that page, it does provide you with the community engagement activities where you will find that community questionnaire. It gives you some background information, the objectives for this data review. It gives you a timeline, all the way, similar to the one that Lisa shared. And of course, we're putting FAQs on there, including our previous presentations. For example, right here, what you're looking at is our May 19th community online information session. That was a more thorough presentation that really gave you a lot of details as it relates to the data review. Please watch it. We know that we have had, as of yesterday, we've had over 30 community members view it. Please do take the time to watch it. The presentation itself is probably a half an hour long, and then this particular link also provides you with all of the questions that we have received and that we received during that time. And of course, now we would like to open it up for any questions that we have. Let's see. Great. So we do have a new question in the budget. Transportation mentioned. I'm sorry, actually, I'm gonna let's try this. I'm gonna go ahead and state what the question is. In the budget, transportation mentioned that the walk zones for some schools would be expanded this summer for implementation in the fall of 2021. Will those walk zones expansions be considered in forming our boundaries? Will the public get a chance to review the expanded walk zones? With the current budget climate, it seems like walk zones should be expanded to try to reduce operational cost. I think I will begin to answer that, but Lisa, I am going to ask you to jump in if I miss anything. I know that we work really closely with our multimodal transportation director, Kristen Haldeman, and she is working right now in looking to expand some walk zones of some particular schools, and she is sharing that information with us to be used in time for the boundary process this fall. She's definitely sharing that information with us by planning unit, and we will definitely add it to our planning unit data, and then we will also provide the relevant information to our community members so that they can understand the changes by planning unit for each walk zone.
I would just add, so this is not a community engagement process in expanding the walk zones. It really is about looking at those areas where the remediations have occurred that can actually ensure that students are still safe walking to school. I know that this is related a little bit, the question to, you know, the budget situation and the pandemic, and I know that Kristen agrees that, you know, we need to get as many kids walking as we can. However, she's looking at it also with that safety lens. She would not be expanding a walk zone to school at a time when we would expect to also see lots of drivers. That was not safe for our students. So we know that there were a number of remediations that were identified in that work a couple of years ago, and she's looking at it with that lens as well.
Great. There is another question. So sorry, let me share. Let me share that question slide real quick. When will the FAQs be updated on the website? Will they continue to be updated after June 5th at the conclusion of the community engagement process? Yes, I myself am in the process of updating those FAQs. I should update those at the end of this 1-hour session with you. So please check on them. And should we continue to receive any new information or frequently asked questions that really have not been addressed, we will definitely post them as they come in. Great. Now, we know that folks do have a lot of questions around the methodology information. Lisa, I know that in the questionnaire, people have been very thankful in the transparency of the process, and they have provided us with a lot of input. But they do have a couple of comments around the methodology and how technical it is, and I'm hoping that you can give a couple of just information on that.
Yeah, so I would mention that in the past, you know, the people who look at the data are probably a unique group. It is not necessarily our general group of parents. It is people who look at data, and the methodology piece, especially here with the 2 options, is very technical. If you don't have an opinion on it, and even through our questionnaire, I think 40% of the people either don't have an opinion or don't understand it. That's okay. It is a technical question. It's sort of looking at, do we apply different rates? And if you don't weigh in on it, it does not impact you know, the final boundaries. It weighs into how we consider how many kids articulate through each school. And when you combine across planning units, those numbers actually, when you look at it by planning unit, are so small that it's not a big impact by planning unit. However, when it gets up to schools, it might be 10 kids per grade level or something, which could be up to half a classroom in some schools if you have smaller class sizes. Did that answer the question, Gladys?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Now, I'm going to try to do this. Switch you out, Lisa. I have a couple of questions that have come in. Let's see. The initial review of the planning unit data table using the current boundaries shows significant differences between the school enrollment in the ASAP 10-year data tables and the planning unit projections in this most recent effort. Understanding the methodology is different between the two. Many of the factors are the same. Can you cover the main reasons why? Robert?
Sorry, I have to unmute.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I usually remind you of that.
Let me put on just a second.
Robert, let me know if...
Trying to share my image.
Oh. Do you want me? I think I need to do that.
So we got that question was forwarded to me probably about an hour ago. So I have to admit I have not given it the thorough amount of thinking that I think the question deserves. But I will say that when we were working on the methodology over a couple of months, including with a consultant who's been working with APS and the county since 2015, since a process called the Community Facility Study. and so we looked at different approaches. One thing to remember is that with any methodology, because the methodologies differ, the results are going to differ as well. There's no getting around that. One thing that was done in previous boundary processes, including the one from 2018 that, you know, I kind of stepped into the shoes when a colleague of ours left, I guess, the beginning of this year or the end of last year. When he was doing it, Lionel White, he would do something where he would try to massage the data so that everything would aggregate to what had been published in the 10-year projections. We chose not to go that route, and that was one of the main topics that we talked with the consultant about. Should we be doing this massage of data so that the data perfectly conforms to what we published in the 10-year projections? And we decided that not to do that, you know, just to make it simpler. Basically, we have a certain methodology. Let's lead that methodology, lead us to the numbers that it leads us to, as opposed to trying to do some further manipulation to reconcile numbers in a way that is appropriate, but that we just didn't want to overcomplicate the process. Another thing to remember too is that we're, you know, ideally, we do not like to do planning unit projections. At the school level is where, you know, where we feel comfortable, where we have data, you know, that's large enough in terms of populations per school. But I would say that planning unit projections is almost a necessary evil. We need to be able to project by planning units, because those are small units that we can combine in multiple different ways for different scenarios for boundaries. So we need that flexibility. But the issue with doing planning unit projections is that you have small populations per planning unit as opposed to looking at a school population for a neighborhood boundary. So you're looking at smaller populations and you're applying all these, and you're applying that multiple different, multiplying different trends to that small population. And so you know, when you do that and you look at it closely, you do get anomalies. You know, we have 300 something odd, 340 or so planning units. And so some of them have small populations and you're applying these trends. So, you know, I think that error will be there, and it increases the smaller you get in geography. It's bound to happen, but that's some background on that question. And again, remember, it's a different methodology. So it will give you different results.
Thank you, Robert. I'm actually going to go to another question. I'll come back to you, Robert, just to give you a pause. I'm going to ask Lisa to answer this next one. Lisa, if you're ready for me.
Ready. Are you going to read it, or do you want me to?
Read it. I'm going to read it. Are you factoring in any changing demographics due to the pandemic? For example, I know families who live in apartments that have relocated due to increased ability to work from home.
So we had this question at the school board meeting last week as well. We are right now not factoring in any demographics or changes due to the pandemic. We don't have any data right now that tells us what that difference might be. And this one's kind of unique. It's not like some of the historical things we've seen before. We're instead continuing to use the data we have, which right now shows we need some boundary changes for particularly Arlington Science Focus Abingdon Elementary School, we have capacity at Drew, and we are opening a new building in 2021. And so using our facilities to serve the kids we know of today. I would also just add that one of the things we're watching on the changes, with everybody being at home and students not being at schools, that means our typical registration process, what it usually is at this point in time. By this point in time, we usually have a good number of kindergarten kids for next year registered. We have just transitioned our registrars to registering students remotely. And this is just beginning to pick up. So even as we talk to our principals, there's a lot of things right now that we're uncertain of. So what we'll do is we'll again look to the projections in the fall, but it's not changing course on this boundary process.
Great, thanks, Lisa. We do have another question, Robert, on option school students and how many come from which planning units. And so basically the question itself is, can you help us understand how you're thinking about students who attend option schools and how many come from which planning units?
So what we did, so if you look at the methodology document, one thing that we tried to explain and hopefully tried to explain it clearly was that how you account for option students and how you account for students who are likely to attend their neighborhood school it's one of the big challenges of the process. So one of the things that we did is we looked at September 30th, 2019 data from actual students who attend APS and were in the APS system as of that date. From that information, we also know what school and grade they attended. So what we did is look at the K-5 students, assign them geographically by planning unit, and then basically we took out the students who currently attend an option program out of each of the planning units. And so that was almost, you can think of it as our springboard going forward. Basically, our universe of students per planning unit were only those that attended a neighborhood school. And to those students, exclusively K-5 are the ones that we apply different rates, like the cohort transition rate, for example, so that K becomes a first grader the following year and a second grader 2 years after. So that we did with the existing students. Another challenge is, how do you account for future kindergarteners? So, we had September 30th, 2019 data, but for 2020, we had to make an assumption about incoming kindergarteners. How many of them would be likely to attend their option school versus their neighborhood school? So that's really where we're asking the opinion of residents and parents like yourself. So in one approach, we basically used the approach that we used in 2018, which is by proportional, by population share. So basically every planning unit had the total K-5 population, including population that would be coming from new construction. And to that, we had a total and we assigned to each planning unit a share of the total population. And so we assumed in one approach that the number of option students per planning unit would mirror their proportion of the population. So if they had a big proportion of the kindergarten population, they would have a relatively larger share of option attending students that we would subtract out from the total population, so that we were only left with the population likely to attend a neighborhood school. And vice versa, if a population, kindergarten population was relatively speaking small, they would have less of a number of students likely to attend an option school. So that was under one approach. Under a second approach, that one came about because the input we kept hearing in 2018 was, if you live closer to an option school, you are more likely to attend an option school and not attend your neighborhood school, which relatively speaking might be further away from where you live. We looked into that. The one thing I will say that it's true sometimes. So around Abingdon and the option school that falls within the Abingdon boundary, that was true. But when you looked at all the other option schools, that was not the case. Regardless, we took that feedback that we heard in 2018 and we took it to heart, and we actually developed a methodology around it. So basically, we created half mile buffers from each of the option schools, and assumed that option schools relocated based on the school board's vote on that regarding Key, Immersion, McKinley, and Arlington traditional. So for all the option schools and the relocated option schools, we took half-mile buffers in GIS, which is a spatial software, geographic information systems. And basically any planning unit that intersected that half-mile buffer, we considered part of the half-mile radius from that option school. So for those, we looked at 2019 trends in terms of, if you live within a half a mile of an existing, not relocated, but existing option school, what is the total percentage of students who attend an option school who live within half a mile and who live outside? We basically took those same shares from 2019, but reapplied them to all these, to existing option schools and relocated option schools for going forward in time. So basically, under that approach, there's a relatively higher share of students within those half-mile buffers or half-mile, radii or planning units that intersect those half-mile buffers that attend an option school versus the other approach. So, and that's one of the main questions, as you know, that we're asking the community as to weigh in, just because we kept hearing during 2018 that first proportional approach, people had reservations on that.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for explaining that. I'm gonna go to Lisa now. I have another question that has come in. Here's Lisa. Oops. All right, Lisa, here's your question. Do you count buildings and complexes that are planned for an area as part of your numbers? At what point do you start making assumptions for how many students those buildings will generate? When the permits have been issued, or when construction has started, or when the building has completed, or when families have actually moved in?
Well, I'm going to talk about this one. Normally, I would defer this one to Robert, but because we've actually, through this process, already identified an issue, I'm going to talk about something that he may not have dug into yet. But Gladys, while we're doing that, could you go to the table, the Arlington County Table 2 and 3 housing unit forecasts, just while I'm talking through it? I think that would be a good resource. So we include those, we count buildings and complexes in units based on what we know from the county, at the point where they have anticipated their opening. So what we actually learned recently and through this process is if it's a complex with multiple buildings, they're putting, right now, the county's database is putting in the end point when they believe all of the buildings will be open and ready for go. And we just found after we staff the schools for next year and through our budget process, there's actually a building that's slated to open in another year that is enrolling students today. So we're working with the county now to figure out if we need to adjust those timelines so that we make sure we budget for the students who are coming. And we have the timeline that really impacts when students will be in our schools, not necessarily when all those buildings will be completed, especially if they're multi-building developments. I think that answers that one, right?
Yeah, and I do have table 2 up, and it shows, I'm not sure if you, Lisa, can see what I'm sharing, but I'm just sharing table 2, which shows forecast year of completion, the development name, the address, the affordability classification of the new development, the committed affordable housing units, new net units, estimate of elementary students from new housing, and then which planning unit it affects. So, and then table 3 is just approved projects.
And I think this is the table that where the lens of the person who lives in the neighborhood and understands the projects going on in their neighborhood, where we probably get the most value for the input. Sometimes the project plans that we get that initially go into this are not always factored in as adjustments happen. And so having eyes of people who live nearby is really helpful to this work. And then Robert, in the projections, uses the appropriate student generation rate and then multiplied by the number of units to include those kids as future students in the projections, again, based on the year when the building's supposed to be opening. And again, we're working with the county to figure out if we need to adjust that information on the opening.
Right. Just because we're on this, Robert, you, if you could just turn on your mic, I think I'm just going to ask you this, and I'm going to leave table 3 up. But the question is, where does your housing information come from, and why are you asking us to verify it? I think we've answered this in multiple answers with Lisa specifically, but where does it come from? I think maybe you can just answer that one real quick. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
Oh, thank you, Gladys. So earlier I mentioned that 2015 community facility study. So since 2015, APS has been working with Arlington County Government's Office of Planning, Community Planning, Housing and Development. They have a research office within CPHD that basically does a population and household forecast. And their population and household forecast is land use driven. So the way that they estimate growth going forward is through net new development. So development above and beyond what we currently have. As part of that 2015 community facility studies, one of the consultant recommendations is that APS and the county work off of the same data. So because the county does their own forecast on future housing units, the recommendation was APS should do the same. So that's what we do. So when you look at the first tab, not the approved projects, Gladys, but the first tab, the residential development forecast, on the spreadsheet you're looking at, the first tab, down below to the lower, yes, that is the county's housing forecast going out, for till 2024. The county does a forecast of housing units going out 30 years because a lot of projects get approved in the county, but there's no, there's only so much demand for housing per year. So that's one of the things that they're, accounting for, so that a lot of the approvals and other projects that might not necessarily be approved but are called for in sector plans and master plans, those are all accommodated within a 30-year horizon. The county provides us the near term. In this case, what we needed was the housing forecast till 2024. In the fall projections that we do, we go out 10 years. So that's where we get our info. And, you know, there are cases though where we would, you know, the reason why we're asking the community to look at the housing forecast is, for example, there was one project called the Berkeley in 2021. I think that's on row 34 in the spreadsheet that Gladys is looking at. The county had it as a 2021 project, but in reality, we actually got contacted by a parent in the Oak Ridge neighborhoods telling us that, you know, they had looked at the developers. In this case, it was Arlington AHC, a nonprofit developer. They had looked at their website and they had noted that, like, instead of opening in 2021, it looked like they were opening in 2020. So we did our due diligence. We contacted AHC and the county and verified that, yes, indeed, it will be opening in 2 phases in 2020. One is, I believe, opening very soon, but they're already taking applicants, and another one will be opening later this year. So we should have, you know, ideally, we need to count that in 2020. So as part of the process of taking input from the community, when I rerun these numbers to be used in the fall, I will recode that Berkeley project instead of 2021 as a 2020 project. And again, that's why we want the community feedback.
Robert, since I have you, I'm sorry, I do want to give you a break, so take a second. But I do have a question. I think it's for you, and it is a follow-up question in option school students. Do you have a summary of how many option school students come from each planning unit for each of the 2 approaches? Reason for the question is for the community to be able to do a full count of students in each planning unit to properly advise APS whether data is correct or it seems right.
So would you mind rereading the question again?
Yeah, and I'm wondering if we need to look at the planning unit data table to see if we offer this. But the question, and you should be able to see it written, maybe. It says, do you have a summary of how many option school students come from each planning unit for each of the 2 approaches? That is the first question. Well, that is the question. Reason for the question is for the community to be able to do a full count of students in each planning unit to properly advise APS whether data is correct or seems right.
No, that's not provided. What we did is we asked for input on the 2 approaches, and then we provide the output, basically the results from both approaches. So on the data table, I'm not sure if you can scroll to that, Gladys.
I can. Just give me 1 second. Planning unit data table. It is, so I'm going to bear with me, folks. Planning unit data table fields. Yep, now I have the planning unit data table live.
Oh, thank you. So what we provided was the output, basically from the data set. If you can scroll all the way to the left. So columns B through E for approach 1, and columns, B through F for approach 1, and columns G through, what is that?
Okay.
Through K for approach 2. those are the students that we're estimating are likely to attend their neighborhood school. So the option students are subtracted out. Again, for us, when the fall comes around, what is important is to be able to take these small units, aggregate them in several ways under different scenarios, to estimate the number of students likely to attend their neighborhood school. So that's what the utility of the table is, and that's the utility of this data for the fall process. What we did include though is column L. That's not going forward in time, but that's a snapshot in time as of September 30th, I believe. So one of our colleagues did a special data set run using that September 30th information. And so that includes the percentage of students who attend their neighborhood schools in school year 2019-20, September 30th, 2019, basically. So I think that could help the person asking the question, because you do see that there is a range of preference for attending a neighborhood school. And in this case, you know, because it would 100% be the total student population, the remainder would be those attending a neighborhood school. But one thing that you'll see as well is if you look at this, especially in something like GIS, is that that question of if you live close to a option school, are you more likely to attend an option school? And when you see that overlaid spatially, I think one of the things that you would see is that it's true sometimes and it's not true sometimes. It depends.
Thank you so much, Robert. Lisa, I have one final question. It's 1:50 p.m. Let me see if we get any more questions, but I do have one question coming up for you. I'm going to leave the planning unit data table up unless you tell me otherwise. Do you factor in these forecasts in building your planning unit data and use them in the boundary formation?
Yes, actually, that's again where it's so helpful to have the neighborhood people looking at the information for their planning unit. We know that when a large building that potentially could have a lot of students opens in a planning unit, that impacts the long-term boundaries. So while it may not be open today, knowing it may open within the next 5 years, if we're hoping to balance boundaries for at least 5 years, we have to include that information. So that is factored into that information. And I would just actually add one thing to what Robert shared about that information on students attending option school. Part of the reason why we didn't do this variation before on the methodology is our options and transfer policy changed up until I think it was fall of 2018. If you lived in a neighborhood, there were preferences for some of our option schools. We've only had 2 or 3 years of students now all being entered through the lottery. So it was a real change in practice. At the elementary level, there's also sibling preference. So there's still some sibling preference in there that is factoring into the numbers. But I think as we get further out, we'll see that it's more proportional across planning units, whereas it used to be if you lived right next to Key, to Claremont, you were in the Drew neighborhood, you could go to those, you could go to the Montessori at Drew, you could go to Key or Claremont if you lived in those neighborhoods, and Campbell had some neighborhoods that were able to get in without going through the lottery. The lottery really changed how we might consider it for use in the projections.
Thank you, Lisa. I actually have 2 other questions. I think I'm going to come to Robert on these. And remember, thank you so much for your questions as they're coming in. And team, I know that we had a similar question to this one, Robert, and it might need more exploration, especially when we're sharing student data, just to make sure if there are small numbers that we are being cognizant of that. So I'm going to go ahead and read this question to you, Robert. You mentioned, actually there are there's a follow-up. Let me read this one. Another follow-up question on option students. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm trying to make this less complicated, but the two questions go together. You mentioned some detail in the May 19th event about which planning units were in the 0.5 mile radius used in approach 2. Can you publish that list of planning units? That is the first question.
Lisa, do you, I would say we could, but I think it's ultimately my supervisor's decision.
No, I think it's fine. I think we should publish it. And I would mention that we did look at doing a mile out, and with the consultant, we only published one methodology because it's not an exact. And actually, Robert, can you clarify if the circle, that radius goes around it, and the planning unit has a portion of it in that radius, are they considered part of that half mile?
Yes. So we'll publish a map as well that we have at the ready already. So basically, as I mentioned earlier, we created buffers from all the option schools, including the ones that we'll be relocating. And basically, in GIS speak, any planning unit that intersected that radius was considered part of that half mile buffer. So it could be that just a small portion of it was in that half mile buffer, but we would still consider it part of that within that half mile. And so, yes, we can certainly publish what those planning units were.
Gladys, you need your mic on.
Yeah, you're on mute. You're still on mute. Sorry, I believe Gladys, for those who are listening in. Okay.
Thank you. My producer screen has lots going on. I do have another follow-up question, and this one is going to go for Lisa. Another follow-up question on option students. Thank you for the clarification. Do you have a summary of the total number of option students in each year, not split up by planning unit, but just the total number of option students by year?
Double checking. So I'm not sure they exist by planning unit in that way. I'd have to go back and check. We're not going to do a new run for this, but if it exists and it doesn't give away anonymous information, we will publish it. But if it's not readily available, we're not going to. We won't have time to rerun this for now. We'll see what we can publish in the fall when we put out the revised data.
So, Gladys, if I understand the question correctly, are they asking in each of the projection years how many option students in the aggregate countywide we assume?
Yeah, look, I mean, it says, do you have a summary of the total number of option students in each year, not by PU, just the total number of option students by year?
So we didn't look at the information that way because you have to remember what we were concentrating. I mentioned the springboard, which is looking at September 30th. Students who attend an option school and a neighborhood school going forward. But what we did mention in the methodology document, at least for kindergarten, I believe in the methodology document, and I might be misquoting the number, 506 option students at the kindergarten level every year of the projections.
So I would just add, if somebody really wants to look at option school enrollment, the same membership report that is published monthly includes each of our option schools. And the other piece I would just add is option schools we enroll through a lottery, so it's controlled entrance. Unlike neighborhood schools, you move into the boundary, you can, you have the right to attend your neighborhood school. The option is through a lottery. So while the number of seats might be 506, or the number that it is this year, I can't remember if it's 506, 504, that might change next year. If all of the neighborhood schools, we open a new school and everybody's capacity is able to bring back down, we would want to do the same for our option schools and might reduce the number of entry-level classes. So that number is based on what we're doing this year and next year, but not necessarily future years when we may recalibrate their entry-level classes.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. And I do believe there is another report that does show the option students. If I can find that, I will definitely include that link on our data review webpage. I think that will be very helpful. Thank you. Let me
Gladys, one thing I will remind, in that data table, the work that our colleague Helen Hartman did, where she took the percentage per planning unit of students that attend their option school. So in the inverse, you can figure out by planning unit how many attended an option program by planning unit.
Yes, yes. So thank you for that question. We want to make sure that you know, our community understands and has that information available to them. I believe those are all of the questions that we have so far, and it is 1:58. I think we have, let me just double check. Yeah. We thank you so much for continuing to engage with us in this process. I will go ahead and post those frequently asked questions just by reviewing all of this information in our previous live sessions, and I will make those available to everybody. Thank you for your participation. There was a Facebook Live in Spanish that was done last week. We've had many views on that, over 1,000, and we hope to make another Facebook Live in English today, very high level, just letting folks know where to find the information. We want to make sure that we use all of our media outlets, our communications outlets, to make sure that we reach folks. One of the things that you can also help us with is, talk to your neighbors about this that's going on. There's a lot going on out in the community, we understand, so we want to make sure that folks know and have access to it. So thank you. We appreciate you. Have a wonderful rest of the afternoon. And thanks to my team. Thank you so much.